So which build is it? Tank, DPS, Demonology, Affliction, or Destruction? What is the best build for dungeon leveling in Phase 2 Season of Discovery from 25 to 40? I bet it's not what you think. Let's review the top 3 best dungeon leveling builds for Warlock, each with their own unique playstyle, strengths, weaknesses, and rotation. And the best part about it all is by the end of this video, I will have shown you how to play every single one of these builds with only one talent setup and gear setup. Not only can you be one of the top damage classes in a dungeon, but you can also flex into one of the best dungeon tanks out there when needed. Let's start off with one of my favorite builds, the Shadow Cleave build. It's insanely fun and easy to play and absolutely pumps damage on trash packs. It's hands down one of the best dungeon cleave builds for 3 to 5 targets and can easily carry your group's damage throughout the dungeon. You'll notice a huge damage spike with this build between levels 28 and 36 due to the fact that you get new ranks of Shadow Bolt and also acquire some of your best talents in the talent tree that make this build absolutely slap. The one caveat with this build is that if your tank is not pulling at least 3 mobs on average throughout the dungeon or is struggling with holding threat on multiple targets, there are better builds for you to play. So let's talk about the rune setup and the damage rotation for this build. For hands, this is the sauce. You'll want Shadow Bolt Volley, which causes your Shadow Bolt to strike up to 5 targets within a chain distance of 10 yards, but for 20% reduced damage for each bolt. This rune makes our cleave damage absolutely insane and is going to be our primary source of damage. And not only that, but nothing is more satisfying to watch than 5 juicy Shadow Bolts firing off from your character with a single cast. For chest, you'll want Demonic Tactics, which gives us an increase of 10% spell critical strike chance for you and your pet, which is absolutely nuts. Crit is extremely important because it synergizes extremely well with talents in our destruction tree, such as the improved Shadow Bolt, which increases our shadow damage by 20% when we crit, and our rune talent, which increases our critical strike damage by 100%. Not only that, but for legs, you'll want Demonic Pact, which causes every crit from your pet to give you a buff that increases your spell damage by 10% for 45 seconds. This also synergizes extremely well with Demonic Tactics and can have almost 100% uptime of this buff in dungeons as long as you keep your pet engaged in every pull. Now, the next 2 runes are not required or recommended because they are difficult to get at low levels. But if you're feeling spicy and adventurous and have some high level friends to help you, they will give you an extreme boost. For waste, you want Shadow and Flame, which increases your fire and shadow damage by 10% every time you crit for 10 seconds. I bet you're starting to see why crit is important for us. Alternatively, there's Grimmer of Synergy, which can increase you and your pet's damage by 25%. However, I've found that Shadow and Flame outperforms this rune on shorter fights, which is typically what dungeons are all about. Finally, for boots, you want Demonic Knowledge, which increases your damage by 10% of your demon pet's total stamina and intellect. This is free damage just for having your pet out, which should be 100% of the time and is absolutely insane. So now that we have our runes, what is our rotation? Our damage rotation for this build is one of the most complicated I ever seen, so pay attention. First, we send out our pet so that we can get a chance to proc our Demonic Pact, giving us our 10% increase in damage, and then immediately after you start spamming those Shadow Bolts. And trust me, it's way more satisfying than it sounds. When you see those Shadow Bolts flying everywhere and you start getting those big fat juicy crits and big damage numbers all over your screen, you're gonna fall in love. For single target bosses that live a long time, you can precast Immolate followed by a Curse of Agony and then start your Shadow Bolt spam. But keep in mind, this build is for cleave, not for single target. The best single target damage is our Fiery Chaos build. It absolutely pumps. You're typically going to want to run this build when your tank is only pulling 1 or 2 mobs at a time, if your tank is struggling to hold threat on multiple targets, or if you're in a raid like BFD where you typically have bosses that have lots of life and high uptime. If you're feeling extra sweaty, you could even swap between this build and the Shadow Cleave build within a dungeon to have the high damage output on trash and on bosses, because all you need to do is swap out your runes. Surprisingly, this build can work very well for AoE once you get Hellfire at level 30, and the AoE can actually outperform Shadow Cleave when you're pulling 5 or more mobs. However, I do find it difficult to pull off the AoE consistently consistently unless the tanks and mages in your group are keeping the mobs clumped up for long enough. In most cases, it's easier and a lot less dangerous to actually just play Shadow Cleave. That said, to run this build, for our chest, we're going to want to run Lake of Fire, which causes our Rain of Fire to leave an area of effect on the ground, debuffing the targets that walk through it, increasing both our fire damage for us and our pet by 40% for 15 seconds, which is absolutely insane. We need to keep this debuff up as much as possible on the targets, and it will be critical for maximizing our damage. For legs, we're going to run Incinerate, which is a hard cast ability that deals fire damage to the target, but also buffs your fire damage by 25% for 15 seconds whenever it's cast. So between this and Lake of Fire, you can see how they synergize extremely well with our fire damage, giving us a total of 65% additional fire damage when you play this build properly. For hands, we're gonna run Chaos Bolt, with absolutely slaps, especially when you have Lake of Fire and your Incinerate buffs up. It's fire damage that always hits, can't be resisted, and ignores all absorption effects. We're gonna use this ability every time it's off cooldown. The last two runes are optional, much like the Shadow Cleave build. If you can get them, great. If not, don't sweat it. But for waste, again, we're gonna run Shadow and Flame for the flat 10% damage boost every time we crit for our fire and shadow spells. For boots, we're gonna run Demonic Knowledge to give us a flat 10% spell damage based on our pet's total intellect and stamina. Now, let's talk about the rotation. You can see a lot of our damage with this build is going to be about managing the uptime of our buffs between Incinerate and Lake of Fire, and that can actually be very tricky. But for single target, we're going to precast an Incinerate to proc our 25% fire damage buff. Then we're going to drop a Rain of Fire instantly on the ground underneath the area where the mobs will be tanked. You don't need to channel the rain, you just need to get a single tick to proc for the additional 40% damage that lasts 15 seconds. After the opener, Chaos Bolt will always be our primary ability. Use it whenever it's off cooldown. When it's on cooldown, we're going to be pumping as many Incinerates into the target to keep that 25% damage buff, and weaving in Rain of Fire every 15 seconds to keep the Lake of Fire debuff on the target. If there's a few mobs and they're living long enough, you can actually weave in a few Imlights prior to the first Chaos Bolt in the rotation to get additional fire damage pumping, and then immediately Chaos Bolt and enter your normal rotation. After level 30, we acquire an ability called Hellfire, and at that point, we can use this for our AoE rotation. It's the same opener as a single target, but the only difference is we replace Chaos Bolt with Hellfire. This rotation should only be done if there's 3 or more mobs, but again, if you're consistently pulling between 3 and 5 mobs, I suggest just running Shadow Cleave. Now, if you're struggling finding a tank or looking to switch it up in your dungeon grinding experience, you can actually be a highly effective tank using a slight variation of the Fiery Chaos build. It's called the Meta Fire tank. Tanking is a highly engaging role as a Warlock, but can be scary to do it because you are the leader of the group and you're setting the pace and the tone of the runs. It's a lot of pressure, and I see a lot of players hesitant to tank, but I will say that in all my years of playing WoW, it has always been an extremely fun role once you're able to master it. That said, Warlock tanks can be the best tanks in SOD. The single target threat and the AoE threat are extremely powerful, and our ability to flex into one of the top DPS classes without having to change a single talent point or gear is absolutely bonkers. To tank while leveling, all you need to do is change up the rune on your gloves and change up your damage rotation slightly for threat. So let's review all the runes super quickly. For gloves, we're going to be running Metamorphosis, which is a requirement. It transforms you into a badass looking demon, increases your threat generation by 50, your armor by 500%, and your chance to be critically hit gets reduced by 6% while in this form. You cannot tank without this rune, so do not try it. As a note, I'm not going to cover the other tanking runes because they are not required for leveling. You are tanky enough with this build, and we're purely going to be focused on damage and threat. That said, all of our threat generation is going to come from our fire abilities, so in order to scale that, for our chest, we're running Lake of Fire for the 40% damage buff on the targets, which directly affects our threat generation. For legs, we're going to be running Incinerate for the 25% fire damage buff whenever it's cast. This will help tremendously with our initial burst damage and give us a huge threat lead on targets, whether it's AoE or single target. Again, the last two runes are optional and the same as the Fiery Chaos build. For waist, Shadow and Flame, increasing our fire damage every time we crit. For boots, you want Demonic Knowledge to give us increase of 10% flat damage damage based on our pet that's out. Now, your main threat generation ability is going to be Searing Pain. It's an instant cast range ability that causes a high amount of threat and will scale up the damage buffs you get from Incineration and the Lake of Fire runes, which means the opening rotation for this build is going to be the same as the Fiery Chaos build. For single target, precast and Incinerate, immediately followed by a Rain of Fire underneath the target for the 40% fire damage buff. Once you're set up, start pumping Searing Pain into the target and continue to do so, refreshing the Lake of Fire every 15 seconds just before the debuff goes away. If you're tanking multiple targets, precast and Incinerate, then grab initial aggro on all the targets with a Searing Pain on each of them as you run towards them and position yourself. Once they're clumped up, put your Rain of Fire on the ground and proceed to Hellfire for 2 to 3 ticks. It's best to use Hellfire when there are 3 or more mobs, but if not, just stick to using Searing Pain. If you don't have Hellfire, AoE tanking is going to be hard, but just weave in those Searing Pains as much as possible. Don't forget that you have 2 taunts with Metamorphosis. You have a single target taunt and an AoE taunt with this build, and use them frequently. These are extremely useful if you lose threat on something or if you have a bad pull and the mobs are running everywhere. All that said, tanking is an art form. There's a zillion situations that can arise during a run, and the only way to learn how to handle them is by throwing yourself in the fire and smashing that like and subscribe button. Now, I bet you're wondering, all those builds look insanely fun, but how do I make it all work together in a single set of gear and talents? So let's go over that. For gearing stat priorities, we're going to focus primarily on spell power, intellect, and stamina. The more spell power we have, the harder our abilities will hit and the higher our threat generation will be when tanking. The intellect helps improve our spell critical strike chance, which is valuable to all of our builds, and the stamina is great for survivability, which not only supports our ability to flex into a tank role, but also gives us more mana through life tapping, which ultimately increases our damage and reduces our downtime. For talents, at level 25, you should already have 15 talent points that you can apply, so let's get started with placing the first 5 points into improved Shadow Bolt. Now, there's certain situations where you'll never be using Shadow Bolts, but in other cases, it'll be our primary source of damage, making this talent incredibly strong because it increases your shadow damage on the target by 20% whenever we crit. The next 5 points will go into Bane, which reduces the cast time of our Shadow Bolt and our Immolate by a half a second. This is huge for us in the cases where Shadow Bolt is our primary source of damage, but it also has a slight benefit in some cases of the Fiery Chaos build, where we use Immolate. After that, we'll put 5 points into Devastation, which increases our critical strike chance for any destruction spell by 5%, which synergizes extremely well with not only our improved Shadow Bolt, but also our rune talent, which we'll be picking up very soon. The next 5 points are going to be a little bit more flexible. I like to place the first one into Shadow Burn, which is an instant cast ability that hits like a truck, costs 1 soul shard to use, has a 15-second cooldown, and does almost as much damage as a Shadow Bolt, but instantly. It's incredible to have for PvP, but it's often used to finish off targets. Next up is going to be a little bit of love for our Imp. We're going to always want to run an Imp in any of our builds for a few reasons. Because of that, we opt to put the next 2 points into improved Firebolt, which reduces our pet's cast time by 1 second, ultimately giving him more frequent damage. Now, the next 2 points are really up to you. They won't make or break the build. You can either prioritize AoE threat generation if you plan to do a lot more tanking by putting 2 points into Intensify, which reduces the chance of being interrupted when you're channeling Hellfire. Or if you don't care about tanking, you can go 2 points into Destructive Reach, which is an extremely powerful when running Shadow Cleave, but I also find it very helpful when needing to kill low health mobs that are trying to flee away from the tank. Now, after you pick, this is where we're going to start to get real spicy. Our damage is going to start to skyrocket for the next few levels. The next point we're going to get is called Ruin. This talent is absolutely broken. It increases our critical strike damage by 100%, which is insane. And just wait, because in 2 more levels, you're going to get the next rank of your Shadow Bolt, which increases its base damage by 40%. For the next 2 points, just head back down the tree and pick up whatever you did in prior, either Destructive Reach or Intensify. And finally, if prioritizing tanking, I do 2 points into Improved Searing Pain, which is our primary source of single target threat, and then 5 points into Ember Storm to help increase our overall fire damage and threat generation. Finally, the last point we have, we can flex anywhere, but I typically put it into Improved Imp. If you're focusing on damage, I'd go 3 points into Improved Imp, 2 points into Immolate, and 3 points into Ember Storm. All in all, my recommendation would be to primarily play the Shadow Cleave build all the way up to 40 and play the other builds depending on your situation, or to break up Monotony. It's one of my favorite builds by far. It's extremely easy to play, it's extremely fun to watch, and it's extremely powerful. And if you can find some time in between smashing Shadow Bolts to smash that like and subscribe button, I will love you forever. Let me know in the comments below which build you love the most, and if you have any questions or thoughts, I would love to hear them. That said, happy adventuring, and I'll see you in the next video.